morning, afternoon, or evening to everybody who follows this channel, Cristero Moderno. Today we're going to talk about Flavius Josephus. Now, a lot of people might be asking, why is it important to learn about Flavius Josephus? Well, anybody who wants to know what the Bible really teaches and the historical context behind the Bible, we need first thing to understand about Flavius Josephus, because he explains to us with a lot of detail the history behind the city of Jerusalem and its environments. Flavius Josephus, as a historian, wrote 5 documents. One of them is this very important document called the War of the Jews, which relates pretty much the history as to how the Roman Empire came to be meddling with Israel. You see, it doesn't matter which Bible you use, whether the Catholic or the Protestant Bible. There is a huge gap in time between the Old Testament, the close and end of the Old Testament, and the beginning of the New Testament. The New Testament, when the New Testament begins, Herod the Great is already dying. The Romans are already in control of Jerusalem. But when the Old Testament ends, things are not at that point yet. In the Catholic Bible, for example, the Catholic Bible closes with the rise of the Seleucid Empire and the beginning of its collapse around the year 160 BC. But no, however, there's still 163 years of a gap. What happened between the collapse of the Seleucids and the rise of the Roman Empire? If you look at the Protestant Bible, the gap is even bigger. That's why one of the reasons why I prefer the Catholic Bible over the Protestant Bible. The Protestant Bible, the last books to be written in the Protestant Bible was Haggai and Zechariah, which were written during the Persian Empire, around the time of Demetrius the Great, 400 years BC. The gap in the Protestant Bible is 300 years more than it is in the Catholic Bible. Question now is how to fill that gap. Now, if you the book we're looking at now, the War of the Jews, even though it's not a biblical book, it does help bridge the gap because it helps explain what happened between the rise of the Seleucids in Israel and the rise of the Roman Empire. If you're reading it from the Protestant Bible, you're still left with 300 years of a gap. But if you're reading from the Catholic Bible, you would probably get to cover the whole Old Testament, then skip over and read about the War of the Jews written by Flavius Josephus. The first volume will get you straight to about the time of Herod the Great. And then from there you can continue with the New Testament, and there you have no gaps in history. Now, Flavius Josephus was a first century historian, so he was a first-hand witness of all the events that occurred. That's another great value of reading Flavius Josephus. As a person who lived in the first century, when it comes to what happened between the death of Herod the Great through the end of the first century, he is an eyewitness of the accounts. As a matter of fact, Josephus dies at about 100 AD. These are the reasons why it's important, if we want to fully understand the history behind the Bible. If you really want to understand the Bible, you have to start by understanding the history behind the Bible. And if you want to understand the history behind the Bible, it is important to look at Flavius Josephus. Flavius Josephus is Every scholar of classical Judaism, every scholar, everybody who is interested in knowing the history of first century Israel, they always include Flavius Josephus as part of the sources. This gives a mountain of importance as to why we need to understand Flavius Josephus. You go anywhere from the universities, from California State University here in Long Beach, California, to the University of Jerusalem. Every single place, when they talk about first history in the Middle East, they will always include Flavius Josephus because that's how much of an authority he is in history of these times. Now, last time we read it, we read about the rise and fall of Alexander the Great, 333 BC, and how when he was at the peak of his power, he dies without leaving behind somebody to inherit the kingdom, giving rise to a battle between his generals. Now, one of the generals that ended up controlling Israel was the dynasty of Seleucus the Great. We read that one of his descendants, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, was very cruel. He was anti-Semitic, and even so, took over Jerusalem and tried to force pagan worship on the Jews. His son, Antiochus V, fared no better. But we see, what we did not notice that is after this point, that very family starts going through a civil war. Cousins start fighting over the land. And part of this was the Demetrius II fighting against the Antiochus branch. And here is where chapter 2 of the War of the Jews begins. Let's see what's going on. Join me as we study chapter 2, volume 1, chapter 2 of the Wars of the Jews, written by Flavius Josephus in the first century. When Jonathan, who was Judas' brother, succeeded him, right here they're talking about the Maccabees. The first of the Maccabees to fight against Greek paganism that was forced on the Jews was Mattathias Maccabeus, also known as a Hasmonean, because they established a dynasty which is known to the Jews as a Hasmonean dynasty. The word Maccabee pretty much is a nickname, the hammer, because they really hammered against the Macedonians, i.e., the house of Seleucus, the Greeks. Now, when Mattathias died, his oldest son, Judas, had taken over. But now, after a few years of really beating the Greeks, Jonathan dies in the heat of battle. He dies, to be specific, in the Battle of Elasa in the year 160 BC, while he is fighting Bacchides, who was a general for Demetrius Soter, Demetrius II. You see, prior to this point, we had Alexander Balas and Demetrius II, both members of the Seleucids, fighting each other. This is the civil war I was telling you about. The Jews had taken side with Alexander Balas because Demetrius, who was one of the children or one of the grandchildren, I should say, of Antiochus Epiphanes, was claiming that as the grandson of Antiochus Epiphanes, he had the right to rule the Seleucid kingdom. His cousin, Alexander Balas, also was making the same claim. So you have Alexander Ballas fighting against Demetrius II Soter. Now, Demetrius wanted to establish the same anti Semitic policies of his grandfather, Antiochus Epiphanes. But Alexander Ballas decided to refuse that policy because Alexander Ballas wanted to get some allies to help him oust um, Demetrius II. So Alexander Ballas sides with the Maccabees to help him fight against his anti Semitic cousin, um, Demetrius II. Now, during the battle between Demetrius II and Judas Maccabee in the year 160, Judas Maccabee dies. His brother, Jonathan, takes over leading the cause for the Jews. This happens in the year 160 BC, approximately 2,183 years ago. Having said this, we continue seeing that it tells us, let's continue, he behaved himself with great circumspection in other respects, with relation to his own people, and he corroborated his authority by preserving friendship with the Romans. Boom, here's how the Romans get involved. No, the Romans don't start walking into Jerusalem and the Holy Land just yet. This doesn't happen for another approximately 100 years more. But here's what's going on. Rome was not an empire yet. This was during the time of Republican Rome. Rome was just a republic. It was not yet controlled by dictators. The Senate and every now and then a consul were the ones who had control of Rome. Yet Rome was beginning to exert its influence throughout the Mediterranean Sea, as they had shown with the great grandfather of Alexander Ballas and Demetrius II. We were talking about Seleucus III, who, as Rome was exerting more power over the Mediterranean, they did not hide that they did not like at all the influence of the Seleucids. They have had previous wars like the Battle of Apamea. They left it very clear that Rome was not in favor of Antiochus or any of his relatives on the throne. Jonathan Maccabee knew this, and he went to Rome to establish an alliance. And then he went to Sparta and established. Sparta was trying to free themselves from the pressure of the Seleucid dynasty as well. So these two powers, the Spartans and the Romans, were beginning to put a check on the power of the Seleucid family, to which Antiochus Epiphanes and these Syrian Greeks belonged. So they were beginning to put a check on them. Jonathan knew this and took advantage of the situation. We even find a copy of the actual verbiage of the treaty with them in the second book of the Maccabees in the Catholic Bible. Moving on. He also made a league with Antiochus' son. Which Antiochus? Now we see that things are getting a bit complicated. We see that now Judas is taking advantage. Jonathan is taking advantage of this civil war in the Seleucid dynasty. We have now that Demetrius is also fighting against Antiochus for control of the empire. So Antiochus' son, I think this Antiochus' son, let me check. I wonder, are they referring to Alexander Ballas. Alexander Ballas, son of Antiochus, or what? Yes, he was. So that's what they're talking about right here. When they're talking about Antiochus' son, Antiochus Epiphanes had two sons. One was Antiochus V, who was anti Semitic, and the other one was Alexander Ballas. This one here that they're talking about is Alexander Ballas. Remember, I explained to you earlier right now that Alexander Ballas, on one was on one side son of Antiochus Epiphanes, and on the other one was Antiochus the Fifth. And from the Antiochus V, by this time had lost the battle, but his son Demetrius II is the one who's fighting here against Alexander Ballas. Yet was not other sufficient for the security for the tyrant Trypho, who was a guardian of Antiochus' son. They did plot against him. Okay, now we find that um, Alexander Ballas dies, and he has a kid now called Antiochus the Sixth, if I'm not mistaken. So Alexander Ballas' son, Antiochus the Fifth, Antiochus the Sixth, is the one who inherits the kingdom. The problem, though, is that Antiochus the Sixth is only 3 years old, so he cannot rule from his own right. So he got Alexander Ballas has his most trusted general, Trypho, to be regent. That means to rule the kingdom in the name of his son until his son is old enough. For the term Trypho, who was guardian of Antiochus' son, Antiochus VI, laid a plot against him, and besides that, endeavored to take off his friends and caught Jonathan by a while, as he was going to Ptolemais to Antiochus. So here's what's going on. Trypho is regent. He's ruling in place of Antiochus the Sixth, because Antiochus the Sixth is still a child. Yet, and this Antiochus the Sixth is the son of Alexander Ballas, who was an ally of Jonathan. Trypho, now seeing that Alexander Ballas is dead and that his heir is still just a child, decides to take certain steps to claim the throne for himself. He wants to kill Antiochus VI. However, this child has an ally in the Maccabees. So now he wants to get rid of the Maccabees and summons Jonathan. And as he summons Jonathan under the guise of some celebration of some sort, in the year 143, Trypho once Jonathan sets foot, he gets arrested by Trypho. Now, Jonathan Maccabee can no longer support the young Antiochus VI. So he has young Antiochus VI murdered. He was but 5 years old. The whole aim with this cruel and evil leader, Trypho, killing this child was because he did not want this child growing up and then wanting to claim his throne and rebelling thus against Trypho's rule. Well, now, this happens in the year 143. Simon, Jonathan's brother, takes over the Maccabees. Let's see what happens. This is around the year 143 BC now. They plot against him with, with a few persons in his company and put him in bonds, and he made an expedition against the Jews. But when he was afterward driven away by Simon, who was Jonathan's brother, and was enraged at his defeat, he put Jonathan to death. Okay, here's what happens now. Trypho, this is the year 143. Jonathan can no longer lead the Maccabees because now he's a prisoner. Simon takes over. Trypho, thinking that the Jews had no more of a leader, decides to invade. But he was not expecting for Simon to take over and establish a a trap for Demetrius, who was coming over. Demetrius was now trying to come over and to try and take Jerusalem. But Demetrius' forces fall in an ambush by Simon, who was angry that Trypho dared betray his brother Jonathan. So they decided to punish Demetrius by ambushing him. Now Trypho is angry, and now he wants revenge. And he has Jonathan still alive in his power. So Trypho starts threatening Simon that he still has Jonathan in his power, and demands to be paid a ransom to free Jonathan. Go ahead. Simon does pay for that ransom to free Jonathan. But Trypho does not hand in Jonathan alive. After having received the ransom, Trypho still kills Jonathan and throws him over. This infuriates Simon. And after this point, it's an all-out war between Simon and Demetrius. Paragraph 2. However, Simon managed the public affairs after a courageous manner and took Gazara, Joppa, and Jamnia. These cities are important because they are coastal cities. Joppa, for example, is what was Jaffa, which is now a suburb of Tel Aviv. The other one is Jaffa, which is about a few kilometers away from Ashdod, west actually, northwest of Ashdod, and thus Jamnia is also a coastal city. Now these coastal cities were important. They are actually in a position for the most important things that come into Israel. One of them is Joppa. And back then, the most important port was Joppa, or Jaffa, as it's known now, Tel Aviv. The other port was Ashdod, which, even though closer to Jerusalem, was not as important because the waters were a lot more shallow and thus were a little bit more difficult for boats to sail in them. But in other case, both of these cities, because they were right on the coast, they were strategic because they controlled what resources came to Israel. If any resources came for the Greeks, they could claim them. These Jews could claim and procure them, take over them. Let's continue reading. He also got the garrison under and demolished the citadel. He was afterwards auxiliary to Antiochus against Trypho. That means he now joins. Now Antiochus the sixth gets murdered. Now we have Antiochus the seventh, which was son of Alexander the First, yet another cousin, fighting against his cousin Demetrius the second. We have the son of Demetrius the First fighting against Demetrius the second. two cousins were fighting amongst themselves for the succession of the throne. Now, Simon briefly joins forces with Antiochus VII because Antiochus VII was fighting to get rid of Demetrius, his cousin. There's a saying that says, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend. The friend of my enemy is my enemy." Antiochus VII was his own cousin's worst enemy, who happened to be the worst enemy also for the Maccabees. So for a short time, Antiochus VII joined forces with Simon Maccabee to try and get rid of Demetrius, whom he besieged in Dora before he went on to his expedition against the Medes. The second half of Antiochus VII's rule, he had to go fight the people of Media and Parthia, now Iran, because they were revolting. So he's telling us before Antiochus VII goes to fight in Parthia, uh, Simon Maccabee is helping him. Yet could not he make the king ashamed of his ambition, though he had assisted him in killing Trypho. So now, even though the Jews under Simon were allies of Antiochus VII, even that, excuse me, taking on my shoes, even that was not enough for Antiochus VII to suspend his anti-Semitic practices. In other words, this alliance between the Antiochus VII and Simon should not have happened because Antiochus, even though Simon was helping him, he still hated Simon because Simon, as a Maccabee, represented the struggle for the Jews to worship God as he should be worshipped. And Antiochus VII, his ambition was to bring to fruition his great grandfather Antiochus Epiphanes' dream of eliminating Judaism from his kingdom. Okay, here could I be, and so Antiochus VII was pretending to be on the side and a friend of Simon as they were fighting to get rid of Trypho. Trypho finally gets assassinated around the year uh, let's see, around the year 138 BC. So now it's the year 138 BC. There a battle takes place, a battle goes out, and in this battle, Trypho gets killed. Now Antiochus VII did not have to worry about taking over Trypho anymore. So now that Trypho is no longer a threat to Antiochus VII, now Antiochus VII shows his real colors and betrays Simon Maccabee and sends a group of soldiers to raid the city of Jerusalem. And they set a siege against Jerusalem. Yet he, though he was now in years, yes, imagine, this is now the year 138. By this time, Simon had spent roughly 30 years in rule of Jerusalem as a leader of the Jews. And he had also fought since, yet, this is total about 35 years of a military lifetime for Simon Maccabee. He conducted war as if he were a much younger man. He still had energy despite his advanced age. He also sent his own sons to the band of strong men against Antiochus. While one of these sons is um, John Hyrcanus, whom we'll hear about shortly. While he took part of the army himself with him and fell upon him from another quarter. So they attacked um, Antiochus the seventh from different angles, trying to beat Antiochus the seventh. He also had a great army of men in ambush in many places of the mountains and was made superior in his attacks upon them. And when he had been conqueror after a glorious manner, he was made a high priest, and also freed the Jews from the dominion of the Macedonians, after 170 years of the empire of Seleucus. Now, finally, the Macedonians, that is, Greeks, under the Seleucid dynasty, were beginning to lose power. Now, the southern part of the Holy Land, which we now call Judea, was finally free from Greek interference, from Greek dominion, from Greek occupation for the time being. Uh, Paragraph 3. This Simon, who, by the way, Simon's name was Tasi, which means prince, also had a plot laid against him and was slain at a feast by his son in law Ptolemy. Simon gets betrayed again. Now that he managed to free himself temporarily from Antiochus VII, he feels free enough to marry off his daughter to Ptolemy, one of his leading generals. Just like Trypho had betrayed Ptolemy the Sixth and had him killed, Ptolemy tries to betray um, his father-in-law, Simon. Turns out by this time Ptolemy had switched sides and started supporting his enemy Antiochus the Seventh. Now, Ptolemy, as a way to betray his father-in-law, pretends to be having a party in Telmaida, which is now the city of Acre, uh, just north of Tel Aviv. Let's go to the map so you can see what I'm talking about. Join me in the map. We're going to find now. We have right here. This is Tel Aviv. If we get closer to the city of Tel Aviv, we start seeing down here. Excuse me. This part of Tel Aviv down here is, you see, Jaffa. That's the ancient Joppa, which they're talking about here. But is going to celebrate a party in Ptolemaida. Ptolemaida is now the city of Acre over here. Who's it about further north of Joppa? So that's where Ptolemy has a party, invites his father-in-law Simon the Maccabee, who we're reading about, has him arrested, him, and two of his brothers-in-laws. That means two of the sons of Simon Maccabee, leaving just a younger one in power to replace Simon and Magus. To replace, excuse me, Simon Maccabee. Now Simon Maccabee has to be replaced by his son John Hyrcanus. Who put his wife and two sons in prison. So you see, Ptolemy, who only married um, the daughter of Simon, to have an excuse to claim the throne. You see, Ptolemy wanted to become a king, but since he had no members who were of royal blood in his family, he couldn't make claim. He flattered Simon. Simon then established an alliance, marrying off his daughter to Ptolemy. Now Ptolemy has a wife from royal blood. Now he can claim the throne and arrests Simon and two of Simon's sons, putting the two of them and his wife in prison. Now Ptolemy can claim the throne. He finally has a marriage through which he can aspire to the throne. And sent some persons to kill John. They sent people to try and kill John Hyrcanus, the only son that was left from the Maccabees. John, who was also called Hyrcanus. This was the youngest son of Simon Maccabee. But when the young man was informed of their coming beforehand, he made haste to get to the city, and having a very great confidence in the people there, both on account of the memory of the glorious action of his father and of their hatred, uh, they could not but bear the injustice of Ptolemy. So now, somebody, there was a spy in Ptolemy's household who comes and informs John and Hyrcanus that just as they had arrested Simon and two of John's brothers, now they come and let her know what's going on. So he runs back into the city, they close the gates, and they resist Ptolemy. Ptolemy also made an attempt into the city by another gate, but was repelled by the people, who had just then admitted John Hyrcanus. And he retired presently to one fortress that were about Jericho. Since Ptolemy couldn't beat Simon, Simon goes I mean, since Ptolemy couldn't beat John Hyrcanus retires to Jericho in a fortress. Jericho's not that far off. It's close enough to actually have a good view of what goes on in Jerusalem and vice versa. The, the fortress was called Dagon, which interesting is the name of a pagan god. Now when Hyrcanus received the high priesthood which his father had held before and had offered sacrifice to God, he made great haste to attack Ptolemy, that he might afford relief to his mother and brethren. Remember, Ptolemy had arrested Simon Maccabee, who by now was dead. Yet his brothers and one of his wives, the one who happened to be mother of John Hyrcanus, let's see, his mother being Maltake, I think it was. I'm trying to remember. Trying to remember who his mother was. I can't remember, but I think it's Maltaki. Now, the mother and two of the brothers were prisoners of Ptolemy. John Hyrcanus was fighting Ptolemy for his life, for the throne, and to free his mother and his brothers. So now, Ptolemy, not Ptolemy, I mean, John Hyrcanus leaves Jerusalem with his army to attack Jericho. When they lay siege to the city of Jericho, Ptolemy brings out and from the walls of the city He's holding John Hyrcanus' mom and brothers and threatens to kill them if they do not lift the siege and return to Jerusalem. John Hyrcanus' mother says, "Don't worry about us. Just do what you have to do to take over the city. Don't worry about what happens to us." Feeling motivated, he starts attacking the city, intensifying the siege. Tommy, feeling that he's about to lose the city, brings out John Hyrcanus' mom again and starts flogging her, whipping her, torturing her and her other children right there in front of John Hyrcanus. John Hyrcanus cannot bring himself to see his mother being mistreated in this way. So he calls all his soldiers off and they retire, hoping this way to save the mother and the brothers. Was this, but was overcome by him as to the just affection he had for his relations. For when Tommy was distressed, he brought forth his mother and his brethren, that is, John Hyrcanus' mother and brethren, and set them upon the wall and beat them with rods in everybody's sight, and threatened that unless he would go away immediately, he would throw them down headlong. At which side Hyrcanus' commiseration and concern were too hard for his anger. But his mother was not dismayed, neither at the stripes she received, nor at the death with which she was threatened, but stretched out her hands and prayed to her son not be moved with the injuries that she suffered, to spare the wretch, since it was to her better than to die by the means of Tommy than to live ever so long, provided he might be punished for his injuries he done to the family. Now John's case was this. When he considered the courage of his mother, he heard her entreaty. He set about his attacks, but when he saw her beaten, torn to pieces with the stripes, he grew feeble and was entirely overcome by his affections. And as the siege was delayed by the means, the year of rest came on, upon which the Jews rest every 7th year, as they do every 7th day. This is the year of the Jubilee. Mosaic law had established that there were this concept called the weeks of days. After each, and this is where we can get the term of a sabbatical year. Just like they had to rest on the 7th day, also the 7th year, there was to be no farming. The land was expected to rest also on the 7th year. This is the year they're talking about. It was called the year of the Jubilee. We must back to, let's see. On this year, therefore, Tommy was freed from being besieged and slew the brethren of John with their mother and fled to Zeno, who was also called Cotilas, who was a tyrant of Philadelphia. Now, here's what's going on. The year of Jubilee required of forgiveness. There were certain interesting rules regarding the year of Jubilee. If I owed money, and when the year of the Jubilee finally came, any debts that I still owed, my creditors would have to say goodbye to their money, and they, by law, were required to forgive the rest of the debt. Same also, if I had a strife, anger with somebody else, and this feud kept going on for years and years, the year of the Jubilee, I was required to forgive. So all these crimes that Tommy was doing against Simon and Simon's family, since it was not the time of the Jubilee, the law of Moses required that Simon not do anything else against against Tommy. Tommy, who was not a Jew and thus was not required to observe this law, feeling finally relaxed, finds a way to escape before the Jubilee is over. And to do this, he first kills off Simon's mom and brothers, and then flees to Cotiles, who was a ruler over the city of Philadelphia in what we now call Turkey. He flees north, um, Ptolemy flees north into Greek territory to seek refuge and asylum. Paragraph 5. And now Antiochus was so angry at what he had suffered from Simon that he made an expedition into Judea and sat down before Jerusalem and besieged Hyrcanus. Now, John Hyrcanus, finally free from his son-in-law Ptolemy, thinks he's free, but no, Ptolemy. I mean, yes, Ptolemy's ally Antiochus VII comes back and yet goes back and establishes another siege against Jerusalem. But Hyrcanus opened the sepulchre of David, who was the richest of all kings, and took thence about 3,000 talents in money, and induced Antiochus by promise of 3,000 talents to raise the siege. Moreover, he was the first of the Jews that had money enough, and began to hire foreign auxiliaries also. Okay, when Antiochus VII set siege to Jerusalem, John Hyrcanus, feeling pressured by the siege, decides to raid the tomb of King David. Gets plenty of wealth from raiding that tomb. With 3,000 talents of gold, he bribes Antiochus VII to lead the siege. So he does. And with the money left over from the raid of King David's tomb, he starts raising an army, not just of domestic but also foreign soldiers. By the promise of that, paragraph 6. However, at another time, oh, by the way, it is important to let you know that the Jews were not very happy that John Hyrcanus did this. They wanted to be free, but they did not want to be freed by the desecrating the tomb of such a honored king as David. Because of this, John Hyrcanus loses some of the support of the Jews. At this point, this is what establishes the foundation of Hasidic Judaism, which in turn establishes the foundation for the first divisions of Judaism, which we later hear about in the New Testament, the Sadducees and the Pharisees. At this point, after John Hyrcanus raids King David's tomb, a group of very devout Jews break up from the main branch of Judaism. There's a branch that later on will separate more into both Sadducees and Pharisees. However, at another time, excuse me, let me check something here. However, at another time when Antiochus was gone, an expedition upon an expedition against the Medes, and so gave Hyrcanus opportunity of being revenged upon him. You see, Antiochus is, as I said, his empire was huge. On the western frontier, his border was the Indus River of India. On the west, it was the Mediterranean Sea. His subjects in the east, the Medes, the Persians, the Parthians, were beginning to rebel. So Antiochus VII leaves the Maccabees alone and goes off to the east to protect his interests in these cities which he was about to lose. When Antiochus VII runs to fight against the rebels in the east, John Hyrcanus takes advantage of this situation and starts fighting to take over all these territories in the Holy Land. Antiochus VII, having an empire so big, he couldn't be both places at the same time. Either he lost the east and then held on to Israel, or he gave up Israel and fought the east. He underestimated John Hyrcanus and thought that he could go back over there and fight the Parthians and the Medes in the east. He made an attack upon the cities of Syria, thinking what he proved to be the case with them, that he should find them empty of good troops. Smart. John Hyrcanus starts by attacking the cities closest to the capital of Antiochus's empire. Sure, this was very gutsy because this took him right into the heart of enemy territory. But John Hyrcanus knew that Antiochus VII was out in the east fighting against the Parthians and the Medes. So Simon Magus was thinking, okay, John Hyrcanus was thinking, okay, I'm so far south of this. The capital of the Seleucid dynasty is so far to the north. He doesn't think I can make it that far. So I can attack it. I'm not going to reach much resistance because Ptolemy VII took the most powerful people in his army to fight in the east. And he was right. He starts attacking all the major cities along the coastland with little resistance for the very same reason. He took Medaba and Samaria. Medaba is on the opposite side of the Jordan River. It's now the capital of Transjordania. And Samaria, with the towns and their neighborhoods, as also Shechem and Gerizim. And besides this, he subdued the nation of the Kuthians. There's a challenge as to who the Kuthians are. I'm not going to go into that. But we see that he took over Samaria and over the lands to the east of the Jordan River. We'll talk about that temple, which was built in imitation of the Temple of Jerusalem, and he took a great many of other cities of Idumea, with Adorian and Maresa. Now, okay, let's go back to the map. Let's see. Bear with me. The Seleucid Empire ranges from this river over here all the way over here. This was its western border right here. Northern border was right over here. The mountain range here, this river here, another mountain range here, all the way to this river here. So when Ptolemy the Seventh and John Hyrcanus were fighting on this side, these areas over here were beginning to rebel. So Ptolemy the Seventh travels all the way over here to subdue and get rid of the rebels over on this side. So so John Hyrcanus takes advantage of Ptolemy the Seventh's absence, and he starts taking over he mentioned that he took over. Oh, excuse me, I'm over here and I'm not even sharing the map. I apologize. Oh yeah, you're looking at the map. Okay. So now he takes advantage to attack. Which cities did we mention? Medaba. You see right here. Then you have Samaria, which is this area right here. Gerizim is a mountain that's right over here. And then he mentions attacking Idumea. Idumea is down here. So John Buchanan stretches his dominion over to the east to Medaba, north to covering all of Samaria, and south to take over Idumea. Let's go back to our reading. So before Antiochus VII leaves, um, John Hyrcanus only controlled Jerusalem. But now that Antiochus VII is gone, John Hyrcanus extends his power. Uh, he also proceeded as far as Samaria, where is now the city of Sebaste, which was built by Herod the king, and encompassed it all around with a wall, and set his sons Aristobulus and Antigonus over the siege. So John Hyrcanus has two kids, Antigonus and Aristobulus, and he puts them both in charge of laying siege around the city of Samaria, who pushed it so hard that a famine so far prevailed within the city that they were forced to eat what never was esteemed food. They also invited Antiochus, who was called Caesarius. Now, here's what happened. The siege that Aristobulus and his son established causes of famine in Samaria. And now they start eating things that they would normally not eat. Pork, for example. But now they're summoning the assistance of this guy called Cyzicenus. Who was this Cyzicenus? Well, by this time, um, Antiochus VII had been captured by the Parthians, never to return back to his home. So his son, um, who takes the name of Sicinius, Antiochus VIII, or Antiochus Sicinius, takes over for Antiochus VII. Samaria, being attacked by the Maccabees, decide to ask the descendant and successor of Antiochus VII, Antiochus Sicinius, to come and with his forces and attack the Maccabees and give them assistance. But Antiochus VII had been the last of the powerful Antiochian people. At this point now, John Hyrcanus had extended his powers so much that now his army was superior to that of Antiochus Sicinius, aka Antiochus VIII. They also invited Antiochus, who was called Sicinius, to come to their assistance, whereupon he got ready and complied at their invitation, but was beaten by Aristobulus and Antigonus. And indeed, he was pursued as far as Scythopolis by the brethren and fled away from them. Ooh, that means he lost so much that he started running away. And the people who were laying the siege chased him. Let's look at what's going on in the map. They're over here in this area, right over here. Nablus is the way it's called now. This city, Samaria, was later called Sebaste, and when the Muslims came about in the 7th century, they changed the name from Sebaste to Nablus. So from this city, Antiochus VIII, Sicinius, runs away into uh, um, Scythopolis, also known as Bethshean, which is over here. So Antiochus's people start running away, and Antigonus chases them until Scythopolis, right over here. Why Scythopolis? Scythopolis was seen about as the border of pagan territory. Technically, like they kicked them out of the Holy Land for good. He crossed the border back into Gentile lands. Now let's continue with our reading. By these brethren, and fled away from them. So they returned back to Samaria. That's Antigonus and Aristobulus returned to Samaria and shut the multitude again within the wall. They set the siege again. And when they had taken the city, they demolished it and made slaves of its inhabitants. Not only did they say attack the city, they destroyed it and made other people their slaves. This is one of the rules. Now, this is important. A lot of people we see in the New Testament, especially around the time of Jesus, reference that the Samaritans and the Jews did not get along. There was a constant hatred between the Samaritans and the Jews. This is partly why. The Samaritans tended to support anybody who came in from abroad against the Jews. We see that today. If we looking at the map that we saw today, we see that Samaria falls within the part of the territory not controlled by those who call themselves Palestinians. We see that in the time of the Maccabees, they supported the Ptolemaic regime. And during the time of the Persians, they're the ones who opposed the rebuilding of the temple. Consistently, the inhabitants of Sebaste, Samaria, Nablus, however you want to call it, it's the same city. They have traditionally been a stone in the shoe of the Jews. That's why the Jews and the Samaritans were not able to look at each other. That's the reason why they could not stand each other. That's why they were enemies. Part of it has to do with this raid of Samaria, where Aristobulus and his brother enslaved the entire population. But they enslaved the population as a way to punish them, because remember, they called for Antiochus VIII Cyzinius to come to their assistance. They're siding with the enemy. They don't want anybody of the Seleucid dynasty to have any control over Israel. The people of Samaria do. So now they punish them by destroying the city and enslaving them. And as they had still great success in their undertakings, they did not suffer their zeal to cool, but marched with an army as far as Scythopolis and made incursions upon it and laid waste to the country that lay within Mount Carmel. So they extended their attacks. Now they're not just going against Israel, against Samaria. They're not happy with just having taken over where they have controlled. Now they control this area right here, from what is now Netanya to just before the Red Sea, the Jordan River, down to the Red Sea, and all of the part down here, part over here on the east of the Dead Sea. But now they're not happy with that. Now they're extending up here to Scythopolis, the borderline, and to Carmel. Carmel is this green area right here, right by Haifa. This place right here, that's Carmel. Now they've extended this story far to the north, from here up to over here, to where it's now Haifa, and to Canaan. By taking over Scythopolis, now they control the Sea of Galilee. Now We're almost done. Bear with me today. We have just one more paragraph to cover. So let's read our last paragraph so we could finish for today. But then these successes of John and his sons made them be envied and occasioned a sedition in the country, and many there were who got together and would not be arrested till they break out in open war, in which war they were beaten. So John lived the rest of his life very happily and administered the government after a most extraordinary manner. So now you have John Hyrcanus took the advantage of Ptolemy the Seventh's absence to become strong enough to the point that when his son, Ptolemy the Seventh's son, grew and old enough to claim the throne, John Hyrcanus was already too powerful for the Ptolemy the Antiochus family to be able to do anything about it. They couldn't do anything about it anymore. Simon's family, John Hyrcanus' family became so powerful that many Jews envied them and tried to establish civil war. But John Hyrcanus was now powerful enough to squash any civil war as soon as it started. So he was ruled happily. And this for 33 years together. He died, leaving 5 sons behind him. So John Hyrcanus finally dies in the year 104 BC. John Hyrcanus dies, let's say, 2,127 years ago. Uh, he died. He was certainly a very happy man and afforded no occasion to have any complaint made of fortune on his account. He it was who alone had three of the most desirable things in the world. He had the government of his nation, the high priesthood, and the gift of prophecy. The two most important political positions of the time he had. And he also was able to prophesy, which was probably the only sadness that he had. For the deity, that is God, conversed with him, and he was not ignorant of anything that was to come afterwards. So much that he foresaw and foretold that his two eldest sons would not continue masters of the government, and they will highly deserve our narration to describe the catastrophe and how far inferior these men were to their fathers in felicity. So, in the year 104 BC, while John Hyrcanus was dying, he had a vision of the future and predicted that as soon as his children, his two oldest children, whom we just read about, Aristobulus and I forget the other name, Aristobulus and Antigonus, were not going to be able to hold on to the kingdom, but that it would collapse shortly. And Flavius Josephus is telling us that in short, he's going to be talking about the problems that arose between Antigonus and Aristobulus. This time, the time of John Hyrcanus, that was the time of the highest peak of the power of the Maccabees, the power of the Hasmonean dynasty, between the year 134 and 104 BC. And at this point, it starts to decay and collapse. That we will see next time we look into Flavius Josephus, the War of the Jews. Long live Christ the King!